The days of a school system configured entirely around the university route will be brought to an end. Our likely next Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, did not hold back in his speech at the end of June, adding that, quote, "We need a complete rethink of how we support the next generation to succeed." The question now is, what do these sorts of comments mean for pupils, teachers, school leaders, and those working on schools policy in Westminster and beyond? In the first of two podcasts on what an Andy Burnham premiership might mean for education in England, I am joined by two experts to look at how our school system could be about to change course in the coming months and years, and what the potential benefits and drawbacks of those changes might be. My guests are Meg Powell-Chandler, Director of the New Schools Network and a former special advisor to the last Conservative government, and Reza Schwitzer, a principal consultant at Avencera and a former civil servant at the Department for Education. I'm Tom Richmond, and to hear more about why and how Andy Burnham may want to reform schools across England, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Let's start by winding back the clock a bit on Andy Burnham's political career, because despite having never been Education Secretary himself, he's been expressing views on education policy for many years through his different roles inside and outside Westminster. Meg, what do we know about Andy Burnham's thoughts on schools from earlier parts of his political career?
Thanks, Tom, and thank you so much for having me. I looked at two sources in answering this question. One was a speech that he gave to the Demos think tank when he was Shadow Education Secretary in 2011. And he made that speech after a policy review that the Labour Party carried out in opposition. So I think that includes some of his thinking as well as thinking of the party at that time. I thought that was quite interesting because he laid out three principles on which he would base education, and they were reward. Basically, the idea that hard work should lead to meaningful opportunities after school. The second was reach, saying that schools should be judged on how well they support every child. And the third was relevance. Learning should reflect the realities of modern life and work. Importantly, I think in that speech as well, I often think in education, the interesting part of it is we all think it's for slightly different things, and the system has to try and accommodate all of the different things that we think schools and education are for. But he kind of really nails down what he thinks schools are for by saying to build strong and prosperous communities in which all young people are ready and able to fulfill their potential as citizens, employees, employers, mums, dads, carers, and neighbours. And I think that's quite an expansive role for schools there. And then the other source I looked at was when he ran to be leader of the Labour Party in the 2015 leadership election. All of the leadership candidates did a short op-ed on what they wanted to do in education for The Guardian. And I thought the really interesting thing from this, especially with all the conversation about devolution that has been coming out in Manchesterism and that, I thought the really interesting thing in this is he weighed up the national role and the local role in education. And he basically laid out that the national role is the what. What do we want for our kids? What's their entitlement? And he was clear that Westminster had an obligation over funding and standards in the teaching profession. But then he was really clear that the local role was the how. How is that entitlement delivered? Saying that local authorities clearly had an oversight role in terms of school place planning, admission standards and exclusions. And I think both of those two things are really, really helpful in providing a framework or a basis through which he might see education in 2026.
Fascinating. Okay, so quite a strong focus on community, looking at the difference between local and national responsibilities and talking about relevance as well, which I'm sure is going to pop up quite a few times in our conversation today. So that's what we see when we dig into the past. But more recently, during his campaign to become an MP on his journey towards No.10 Downing Street, Andy Burnham has again been very vocal about schools and education more broadly. Reza, what has he been saying about schools in recent weeks as he gets closer to No.10?
So I think it's really interesting to have a prospective Prime Minister talk so much about education. It's not something that we've necessarily been used to in recent years, with education falling a little bit down the political pecking order. I think I'll make sort of two comments about the how Andy Burnham approaches policy in general, but education specifically, and then I'll make kind of three specific areas that I think we'll see him focus on. So on the sort of how, I think the first thing to say is that almost completely the opposite to the current Prime Minister, Andy Burnham really, I think, prides himself on being able to set out a vision. He's really clear what he likes. He's really clear what his focus is. But what we don't have and what we shouldn't expect is a sort of 10, 20, 30-page detailed manifesto. What he says tends to be fairly big picture and high level. I think the second thing to say is that Andy Burnham is quite radical on education in a way that is different to what we've had in the past 2 years in terms of the how he approaches this policy area. In general, I think he is unlikely to be the sort of Prime Minister who will just say, well, we just need a little bit of incremental change. He has quite big, bold vision for how things ought to be, and that's what he spent the last decade implementing in Manchester. And then in terms of the sort of three areas specifically that I think he will focus on, and he's been quite clear about this, I think the first is skills, and I think specifically ending the dominance of the university route. So he's talked about the days of a school system configured entirely around the university route will be brought to an end. That is quite a strong statement and gives you quite a strong direction of travel. And that's linked to all the conversations about how school prepares young people for the world of work. It's linked to a conversation about parity of esteem and parity of aspiration around technical versus academic. I think the second area where he said less but will be equally important is special educational needs and disabilities, also referred to as SEND, partly because of the situation in the sector where it's just so clearly in a crisis situation, but also because of some of the things that Meg alluded to. He is likely to have a quite expansive view of what the education sector should do and how it should give opportunities to lots of different young people across a very broad spectrum and including the most disadvantaged, into which category SEND would fall. And I think finally, and again, Meg referenced this, there's a fundamental question about how his wider views on devolution impact specifically in education. In the past, he has talked about a preference for, local authorities having a role in education. Given where we are now, it's more likely to look like how do regional combined authorities, which the Greater Manchester Combined Authority is one example of, but also other regional and local bodies, how do they have more of a role in education and what does that look like? The challenge is going to be that we have spent much of recent years actually dialing that back. So even in areas of education policy and schools policy, which are more devolved, like special educational needs and disabilities, actually a lot of what our reforms as a country have been designed to do are to reduce the disparity between local areas. When you look at SEND, it's things like having much more consistent funding bands or much more consistent sort of quality of provision. And in a way, what you're doing is actually Whitehall is getting more involved in the way that local authorities deliver services, not less. So I think that's an area which is particularly interesting in terms of how Andy Burnham's personal views will interact with the kind of current policy situation that he's inheriting.
OK, so it seems that we have a Prime Minister in waiting then who has quite strong views potentially on whether our school system is heading in the right or wrong direction. But I wanted to pick up first, Reza, on that point you made around small and incremental changes, because we've just had last year the government's curriculum and assessment review, which was built around the mantra of evolution, not revolution, because the review felt that small incremental changes was a better approach rather than large sweeping reforms to the school system. And yet, as you're saying, Andy Burnham is now potentially going to put forward some very significant changes, particularly in certain areas around ending the dominance of university route and parity of esteem. So, Reza, do you think the curriculum and assessment review's incremental approach could quickly come under strain with Andy Burnham in charge?
I think it will, but Let me just expand on that a little bit. So I think the first thing to say is that there is an opportunity here, because I think we've missed a trick on curriculum and assessment a little bit. A lot of the objectives that ministers have for curriculum assessment are not best delivered by redesigning the qualifications. They're actually a behaviour change problem. And what I mean by that is, if you want parity of esteem, which is not a phrase I desperately love, but lots of people use it, basically meaning if we want people to attach the same value to technical and vocational education as they do to academic education, is the way you do that to redesign vocational qualifications, or is the way you do that to change the way that people more broadly view those sorts of careers? The DfE has got itself in a bit of a muddle over decades, by the way, of thinking that the way to solve this problem that we have in our society, which is that we, compared to comparator nations, are very focused on an academic route and less focused on a vocational route. The way to solve that is to repeatedly come up with new vocational qualifications or redesign qualifications. The reason I think Andy Burnham has an opportunity here is because what he's shown in Manchester, and this is often used as criticism of him, so he's done this thing called the MBAC, and people say, well, it's not a qualification, it's not a qualification wrapper. And I think Andy Burnham would agree with that, because that's not actually what it's intended to be. The genius of the MBAC is that it's all about the presentation, the communication, and the way that the education system interacts with the world of work. So what Andy Burnham has done is create pathways in the technical and vocational space that people in the world of work understand, that young people can feel proud of, and that then connects A to B. So if you want to go into industry A, you should do pathway B. And I think what he's shown is that you can actually make a lot of change in the education system through that sort of framing and managing from the top, rather than going into the detail of the individual qualifications. Do I think he will also want to upend some of what has come out of the curriculum and assessment review? I think he probably will. It's probably too late on the national curriculum unless he wants to be really disruptive, because they're consulting on national curriculum content within the next 2 or 3 months. But I think on something like Progress Aid, I suspect he will be more willing to change the last government's approach. By the last government, I mean the Conservative government's approach to Progress Aid. And I think he does have the time to do that. What will be interesting is whether the sector is willing to accept further chop and change. Because as we know, the one thing that school leaders hate more than anything else is politicians coming in and out in quick succession, and there being no continuity and no understanding of where the reform is going long term.
Meg, we've seen this Labour government stick broadly with many of the policies that the previous Conservative government put in place, particularly around the curriculum and a heavy focus on, say, GCSE exams. But as you were saying earlier, Andy Burnham has talked about a more relevant curriculum being a big priority for him, particularly in that post-14 space. So do you think it will potentially be doable for a new Labour Prime Minister to set a new course in some of these areas?
I think that if you take a couple of steps back, how are you successful coming into a department mid-term? And I think that Reza kind of hit the nail on the head at the very beginning when he said Andy Burnham has clearly got a vision, but he doesn't have a plan. And I think your listeners, if they have paid much attention to education policy of the last 10 or 15 years, as I'm sure many of them have, will have probably heard countless number of education secretaries and even some prime ministers using the phrase, we need to have parity of esteem between vocational and academic. We need to raise the status of vocational. Yet we haven't seen that come through, because what that has been an ambition, not a plan. Now, what he has done in Manchester is a really, really interesting example of what you can do within the system without necessarily changing the system. The interesting question for me, especially with the whole emphasis on devolution, is the MBAC the end point of his thinking? And actually, when he has the keys to the whole system, he just wants to encourage the devolution across the country to see more areas develop their own version of that, engaging with their own industry, supporting their own colleges, possibly with some national incentives or whatever. Or as soon as he gets the power of the whole system, is he going to change that system again? And in order to do that, you have to have a plan. If we think back about who the effective secretaries of state or prime ministers have been, they have had a plan. And it's rarely a complete plan, I hasten to add, like it doesn't necessarily need to be a detailed manifesto, but it is a kind of outcome that you want to achieve. It's the values that you guide it, and it's the metric of how you know after a period of time you have achieved what you want to achieve. you need to not just have the plan of what, you need to have the plan of how, which is, you need to have your political support, you need to have your sector support. And really importantly, especially looking at education over the last couple of years, you need to have the longevity in office to actually kind of implement whatever that plan is so that someone new doesn't take the helm and change the direction of travel.
Well, on this point around how and implementation, we have seen with the MBAC, these employer-focused pathways that Andy Burnham has promoted as Mayor of Manchester, that it is certainly possible to bring employers closer to schools, that you can try and build up some work experience opportunities, you can try and build better links to the world of employment. But Meg, a lot has been asked of employers in recent years, such as lengthy work placements for T-level students, which have been a real struggle. We've had lots of governments try and expand apprenticeships for young people, which has also been a bit of a struggle. So where do you think schools fit into this? Are schools able and willing to take on more responsibility for building stronger relationships with employers, or is that just not going to be within their skill set?
Using the MBAC as the example to take is an interesting way into this, because what they have done hasn't been to say, schools, you need to do this. It has been using the convening power of the mayor and the combined authority to help support that, and then saying to schools, you can use this. I hasten to add on the MBAC, by the way, it is a programme which everybody is leaning into and looking at a lot. They've just published the second year impact assessment of it. It's a 2030 vision of this plan. So we are still in the early days of this, and that is promising. And I don't want to say that therefore we shouldn't look at it. But, they've had 45 schools have used the MBAC so far. And that is very, very different than changing the way that the 22,000 schools in the entirety of the England education system will work. But I definitely think that there does need to be, if you're going in that direction, you need to think of not asking each individual school to do this. There needs to be ways in which you have people that do that convening. And then there are two other points I'd make. One is, we constantly hear that employers have problems with the skills levels or the education levels and things like that. You've got a power of an employer to change that. You've got to get involved to do that. So I don't think you can, stand on the sidelines and complain. You've got to get involved if you want to change the workforce and change the way that people are coming through. And then the second point, which is actually a wider devolution piece, is this is great in massive conurbations. This is great in London. This is great in Greater Manchester. How is this going to work in Devon and Cornwall? How is it going to work in Norfolk and Suffolk, where we don't have these large population centres and huge amounts of kind of industry centred around there? How are these kind of things going to work? That's not saying they won't. I'm just saying that you won't be able to take a model from one place and directly implement it somewhere else.
Reza, how do you see this issue of schools' capacity to engage with employers? This sort of engagement wasn't really prioritised much under the last Conservative government. We saw big cuts to careers education during the coalition government years, although, to be fair, they did set up the Careers and Enterprise Company. So where does that leave this whole relationship with schools and local employers that Andy Burnham might well want to put rocket boosters under?
It's possible. Of course it's possible. The key word that you used, Tom, in the framing of your question is prioritisation. All good government ultimately comes down to prioritisation, in my view. When I was in the delivery unit and Meg and colleagues were advising ministers in the department, the conversation we constantly had was, Secretary of State, what are your priorities? And we use the delivery unit as a forcing function to say you can only have, whatever it is, between 4 and 6 priorities. And then we really need to focus in on those. And I think that's become harder in the social media age and in the sort of, rise of populism across the Western world phase, because everyone is totally understandably scared of declaring that anything has been deprioritized. So if you're asked about anything and you imply that that's not the priority, there's going to be a clip up within 30 seconds posted by the relevant campaign group, broadcast to all the people in that particular area that you've deprioritized. And, Meg will have seen this as well. Within the department, it works the same way, right? So if you're the Director General or the director of an area that's being deprioritized, you better believe you're going to fight pretty hard against that. So what you end up with is this sort of corporate mush where everything is the priority and the Secretary of State is trying to do everything across all of education. And that doesn't work. And that's why school leaders then experience one day they're being asked to be nutritionists, another day they're being asked to be mental health practitioners, another day they're being asked to be, social workers. So now I'm being a little bit deliberately glib, but that is the reality of when I talk to school leaders, often how they feel, which is like, yes, of course it's important that we tackle misogyny online, particularly amongst young boys. Of course, it's important that children eat healthy. Of course, it's important that, young people's mental health is looked after. But schools have finite resources. Schools also need to allocate time and money and effort towards a finite number of things. And we've got in a very difficult situation where we're asking civil servants, public servants to do everything all the time, and that doesn't work. The reason I think Andy Burnham could be the cure, at least in the short term, is that he actually really is quite clear when he talks about what his 2 or 3 priorities are. And what I'll be interested to see, which is sort of what Meg alludes to, is what happens when that meets the reality of working in central government. Because he will be lobbied from every angle. He will have civil servants from every team in the first few weeks coming and presenting to him and telling him why, their thing is the most important, or at least the sector of state that he chooses to put in education will have those meetings. And then it's a question of, can you deliver? Can you hold your ground? Can you keep focusing on the things that you want the priority to be? And then you can deliver some real change. What schools need is continuity. They need to know over a period of more than a year what they are being asked to focus on and what that looks like in real practical terms in terms of what they have to deliver to get there.
As Reza was speaking, I was just reminded at the New Schools Network, we held an event which brought together former Education Secretary Estelle Morris and former Education Secretary Michael Gove to talk about future reform of the education system. And Estelle Morris said this thing about signals. She was thinking back to the time that in 97, they wanted to make it clear that there was the focus in primary on literacy and numeracy. So they based the entire Ofsted framework on just looking at literacy and numeracy to make it clear that they were the priorities. And the impact of that was that Ofsted were going into schools that hadn't taught PE for half a term. The difficulty in kind of putting these signals up is that it's the way that you do them, because people respond to incentives, people respond to messages, and you've got to be careful that everybody just doesn't go and focus on this new thing, because ultimately schools are doing a really important job, and actually a lot of them are doing it very well, of educating our children in that very, very necessary knowledge and information that they need to help grow them as individuals, to help prepare them for life. It might not be within employability speak, but we've got to make sure, there's been a huge argument between the knowledge curriculum versus the skills curriculum in the past. I think we're hopefully coming beyond that, and everybody sees the fact that you do need to have a mastery of knowledge in order to develop skills. But that's where the kind of the detail of this stuff is actually quite important, because it's the detail that the system will ultimately respond to as well as the signals.
You mentioned this point around employability, because this is something that Andy Burnham has talked very explicitly about in the past. He thinks employability skills such as self-management, team working, problem-solving, critical thinking, etc., he thinks they're absolutely crucial. He's previously said that, quote, "We need a school system that instills those essential qualities, builds strong characters, and encourages independent learning." So Meg, based on what you just said, what do you make of that language around employability skills? Is this a priority that could be set and that schools could deliver and make it a core part of their offer? Or is that going to be too much for them?
Just to kind of copy a little bit of glibness here, I think some people would have found it bizarre that teaching children how to brush their teeth became a core part of what schools are able to deliver, but it happened. And ultimately, schools are incredibly adaptable, and if it is deemed that they need to do this and the curriculum is set up that way and the accountability measures are set up in a certain direction, it will orienteer the system to deliver that outcome. Again, going back a step, what levers do you have to change things within the school system? You basically have the accountability measures, you have funding, and you have capacity building. The way that Andy Burnham created the change in Manchester, I think, was through that capacity building, because he had the ability to kind of do that convening. The question and what they want to do when they come into the national kind of having control over national policy is how he's going to change the system to prioritize those things like employability skills. I would automatically ask, how are you going to measure whether or not somebody's got employability skills? Are you going to do that within a school setting? Are you going to change the destination metrics within the accountability framework? The White Working Class Educational Inquiry last week kind of said that actually we need to change accountability metrics to bring destination in to outcome metrics and things like that. So there are different ways in which you can do it. And whichever way you choose will create a signal to the system about how they should respond to that. And the other thing I would just want to quickly make the point that it cannot all just be on schools. Obviously, schools is the way that government like to implement policy to do with young people because it is the lever that they have to do things. But if we think about employability skills that people are talking about, the self-management, the team working, the problem solving, the creativity, the critical thinking, yes, you're going to have experiences of that within a classroom environment where a subject is being taught to you. You're also going to have experience of that in the schooling that sits around that. But you're also going to learn that from the sports team that you're part of, extracurricular enrichment activities, either in school or out of school that you might be part of. Hey, even, I don't know, having a job. If we could make it a lot easier for kids just to have a job on a Saturday, like I used to have when I was growing up, that teaches you all of these things. It doesn't necessarily need to be on schools because, as I think a lot of this conversation has suggested, things are zero sum. Schools can only do so much, so you have to be really careful about the things you ask them to do.
Reza, what's your take on a potentially greater role for employability skills in the curriculum? Do you see that as a potentially positive step?
I see a focus on employability as hugely positive. I think whether that's in the curriculum, co-curricular, extracurricular is the more interesting debate. Do we want young people to leave school with the ability to work in a team, with the ability to communicate? I just think the answer is obviously yes. But there are people within the education sector that don't believe that. There are people within the education sector that believe that, given the evidence on maths and English, given an additional hour of tuition, young people should just be taught more maths and English, right? And I think that view was overly prevalent under the last Conservative government, and that did a lot of damage. The reason that sort of argument makes me particularly cross is that the sorts of sort of top schools, like, your independent schools, your grammar schools, that are the schools that are giving us prime ministers and senior politicians and chief executives, etc., don't follow that approach, right? So, if you go into top independent schools, they don't just sit there doing maths and English. They also do Model UN, they do public speaking, they do debating. And it irritates me that we take a different approach to disadvantaged young people and say, oh, well, the evidence says you should just keep doing more maths and English, more maths and English. I'm not disputing that maths and English are clearly very important, but I think the balance has gone too far one way. We need to agree, broadly, how do we want pupils to leave at 16, at 18? And I think if you ask the public, it will be very popular. And indeed, I've been in focus groups where this has been discussed. The idea that communication is a really valuable skill. I think the question where there's more genuine debate is on the how. So I think, when you listen to someone like, Daisy Christodoulou, what she was originally disputing, and I agree with her, is that the act of sitting in a room and trying to teach a lesson on communication is not clever. It is not a good way to make sure that young people have communication skills. So there's a sort of intellectual challenge here of how you do something which is knowledge rich, which also then leads to skills. There are some skills that are a lot more, I think, domain specific. For example, in order to be a car mechanic, you need to learn the knowledge of what it takes to fix a car, and then you need to do it and you need to practice it over and over again. The problem with something like communication is that the knowledge base to be good at communication is fairly limited. What you need to do is use an existing knowledge base like history or politics or English, and then within that context, train and practice communication. And so then the question is, well, how do you make sure that happens? And the other great irony from the last Conservative government is that it talked endlessly about autonomy and empowering school leaders, and then in a whole range of areas basically didn't trust them and took that autonomy away from them, right? It said that we should trust school leaders and we should give them autonomy, but then it was incredibly prescriptive about what subjects and what kind of level standard, young people should be entered into. And by that, I mean, the use of progress and attainment 8, the use of the EBAC measure, the reduction in the availability of a whole range of kind of wider qualifications, and the removal in many subjects of a kind of foundation tier. There need to be some incentives. We need to have a way to know whether schools are doing these things. And that's harder than assessing knowledge often, because, if it's through extracurriculars, are you going to have a tick box where you say, do they do extracurriculars? Are you going to go in and assess the quality of their DOV or their cadets? That stuff just doesn't work as well on that side. So we need to be a bit more creative. And I think part of the answer has to be teacher autonomy and school leader autonomy. And we have to have an element of trust with some checks in place. And then I think there are some interesting creative solutions, particularly because of technology, Tom, you and I have discussed in the past the extended project qualification. There are ways of doing assessment. There are ways of thinking about these things, particularly where you can deploy technology if you're using kind of video assessment or whatever it may be. I think we need to move away from the debates of the last 15 years about either or and just agree that, of course, we want schools to do these things. Of course, we trust teachers. At a system level, what are the helpful and practical ways that we could provide schools with both the help they need, but also check and challenge? And I think until we get to that place, we're just in this seesaw of kind of, like we've ended up with, unfortunately, on oracy, which is an area very close to my heart. We kind of talk about it. We all agree it's super important. And then it just sort of drops off a cliff because no one wants to bring back the speaking and listening assessment with GCSE English. No one can figure out a better way to do it. And then we just sort of move on to the next discussion. And I think that's really sad.
Finally, let's talk about the school system itself, because as Meg was saying earlier, if you track back some of Andy Burnham's previous comments, he's talked a lot about his support for local authorities. We know he's a very firm believer in comprehensive education. And we also know he's been quite sceptical about academies and grammar schools as well in the past. In fact, he's even quoted as saying there would be no more free schools during his time as Shadow Education Secretary back in the early 2010s. Meg, we've had a pretty consistent direction of travel towards academies and multi-academy trusts since 2010. So where would that leave a new Prime Minister who is sceptical about that agenda? Is it just too late to change course, or do you think we might see some movement there?
I never think it's too late to change course, but I think you've got to have the plan, the support, and you've got to know how you're going to do it. And also within the priorities that the Prime Minister is going to come into office with, he's got a defence plan he needs to fund. He's got a welfare budget he needs to sort out. He says it's growth and productivity. These are all challenges he's got to do. As Reza was basically saying, when you're in a department, you can only have a certain number of priorities. The same is true across government. Time is zero sum. That is the whole problem, right? And I think that you've got to think of the situation where you are rather than maybe where you were when you made previous statements. So thinking about free schools, obviously I'm the director of the New Schools Network. We advocate for more free schools and we champion innovation and school autonomy within the education system. In the early days of free schools, it wasn't clear if they were going to be any better than any other schools. I think that there's a body of evidence that shows that free schools are very effective. But at the same time, we're in a declining roles situation. So I can also see why you might not do new free schools because of the fact that you don't have that population need in the way that you did do over the last 10 and 15 years.
Reza, you've already mentioned that Andy Burnham's clearly going to be a very big advocate for more devolution. Do you think that's likely to feature much in the debates about the structure of the school system going forward?
I think we've gone too far to significantly scale back the way that the multi-academy trust system works, certainly not in the next couple of years. I think what Andy Burnham has said is things like, and he did an article for the TES on this, I think it was a couple of years ago. He talked about mayoral combined authorities overseeing the school system in their area. I guess the question I would ask is, overall, we understand what Andy Burnham wants to get out of devolution, which is that he feels, and lots of people agree with him, that decisions in Whitehall have been made in a way that don't benefit people in the rest of the country. I think the challenge on education is that it's not clear that the solution that is being proposed would be that different, because at the moment, you already have a situation where many multi-academy trusts are based regionally, they're not national. They are already taking in a whole swathe of areas their own decisions. If you bring in a mayoral combined authority or a local authority, it's not clear that what you're doing is actually empowering local people. In a way, you're actually adding another layer, right? So this is where when Meg talks about the detail is really important. In an area like special educational needs, as I alluded to earlier, what regional and local autonomy has led to, it has been argued, is a postcode lottery, where if you're a child with special educational needs in one area, you have vastly different experience and outcome to a child in another area. And we've decided as a country that that's unacceptable. So this is almost the opposite, right? This is Whitehall actually really caring about what's going on. Now, you could say that it was too slow to do so, and I think you'd be right. But this is Whitehall now saying, actually, we care so much about what's going wrong in different local authorities that we're going to come in and create a national system and a national structure. So the high-level vision is interesting, and I think it could lead to huge opportunities. I think when it interacts with the current policy space in education and schools, you start to get in a little bit of a muddle about actually why are we doing this and what is the outcome that we want to derive from it.
OK, we are almost at the end of this episode, so it's time for one last question. It's fair to say that the first 2 years of this Labour administration have not made sweeping changes to primary and secondary schools in England, despite some new policies, such as breakfast clubs, being put in place. But with up to 3 years to go until the next election, there is plenty of scope for a new Prime Minister to change all that. So, my question is, what advice would you give Andy Burnham about how he should approach the school system over the remainder of this Parliament? Meg, what would be your message to the likely next Prime Minister about schools?
I think that school autonomy is really important. And actually what we've seen this government do over the last 2 years has restrict that with their changes to academies and free schools through the schools bill. And so what I had asked the new Prime Minister coming in to do would be to set out the expectations they have on the system. I hope that they are relentlessly focused on improving outcomes for disadvantaged pupils, set up the system to incentivise those outcomes, and then let the school system get on and deliver it, making sure that high standards are being asked and delivered for every pupil.
Thank you, Meg. Reza, what advice would you offer Andy Burnham about schools over the next 3 years?
3 things. Prioritisation, which Meg and I both touched on repeatedly. Be really clear with your education secretary what you want them to focus on or what you jointly agree you're going to focus on. Thing 2, appoint an education secretary who you have lots of confidence will be a fantastic education secretary. And that sounds like an odd thing to say, but we know that in politics and in reshuffles, it's tough and there are lots of kind of internal political considerations. In an ideal world, maybe give someone an opportunity who's already in the department. I think we've got a fantastic crop of junior ministers within the department, and I think some of them would do a fantastic job. And 3, which applies to education and every other area, genuinely focus on how to run government and how to get the best out of the civil service. Because underpinning all of the problems we see in government implementation over the last years, decades, it all comes down to how government works and how politicians interact with the civil service. And I don't know anyone who thinks that currently that's working 10 out of 10, really amazing. I think there's a real opportunity to reset, refresh, and design a department for education that is capable of delivering to a really high standard across all of this government's priority areas.
Thank you, Reza. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Meg and Reza for sharing their insights on what may prove to be a very busy few years in schools policy with a new Prime Minister in place. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.